Sure, yeah. Good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming, both in person and for our viewers online watching us on BGC TV. I'm Aaron Glass, professor of anthropology here at the Bard Graduate Center, and on behalf of Director Susan Weber and Dean Peter Miller, I'd like to welcome you all to this year's Iris Foundation Awards lecture. Opportunity to hear from one of the eminent scholars who, at a luncheon tomorrow, will receive a prize from the BGC for excellence in the fields of decorative art, design history, and material culture. And for our remote viewers, you may tweet questions after the talk to hashtag BardGradCenterTV, so keep that in mind. Tonight, I'm enormously pleased to introduce Nicholas Thomas, one of the most influential contributors to the interdisciplinary field of material culture studies. With a BA in anthropology and a PhD in Pacific history from Australian National University, Thomas is now, appropriately enough, professor of historical anthropology at Cambridge University, professorial fellow of Trinity College there, and director of the university's renowned Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology, which reopened 3 years ago after a major renovation, a revitalization really, which Thomas oversaw, and which actually opened just a few days after his last visit here to the BGC. In addition to being an adroit voyager through library, archive, and museum, he has conducted ethnographic fieldwork throughout the Pacific, from Fiji and the Marquesas Islands to Papua New Guinea and New Zealand. Thomas has long been a key node in global research networks. Early on in 1996, he helped establish the Center for Cross-Cultural Research at the Australian National University, which pursues projects in history, art history, and visual anthropology. Most recently, from his location at the Cambridge Museum, he's been working with international colleagues on a major project to bring new perspectives to the study of Melanesian art and to our understanding of ownership, heritage, and relations between museum collections and contemporary indigenous communities. In 2013, the British Museum published one product of this endeavor entitled Melanesia, Art and Encounter. Thomas's seminal 1991 text, Entangled Objects, required reading in any course on the anthropology of art that I've ever taken, taught, or heard of, helped redefine the field by situating the material culture of the Pacific, not only in terms of local cultural contexts and anthropological theories of exchange, but also in terms of the historical dynamics of colonialism as manifested in particular locations and specific episodes of social encounter. His work in general resituates the Pacific as a longtime nexus for global cosmopolitanism, for the productive flow of people, goods, and ideas along multiple and far-reaching trajectories. He has explored such broad topics with scholarly depth and originality in over 70 articles and 30 books, including a number of major monographs. Out of Time, History and Evolution in Anthropological Discourse from 1989, Colonialism's Culture from 94, Oceanic Art, 95, Possessions, Indigenous Art, Colonial Culture, 99, Discoveries, The Voyages of Captain Cook in 2003, and most recently, Islanders, The Pacific in the Age of Empire from 2010, winner of the Wolfson History Prize. A few years ago, Thomas helped coordinate the monumental, multi-authored volume Art in Oceania, A New History, winner of the 2014 Art Book Prize, which a prize judge aptly called magisterial. In addition, he's a frequent collaborator with contemporary indigenous artists and has curated or co-curated exhibitions, including Skin Deep, A History of Tattooing for London's National Maritime Museum, Cook's Sights, which is oddly hard to say quickly, despite being two short words, for the Museum of Sydney, and numerous shows at his own Cambridge Museum. Less familiar to many North Americans, perhaps, he's also a regular contributor to exhibition and artists' catalogs throughout Melanesia and the Pacific Islands. As an academic, Thomas has forged a unique path and provided a model for how to integrate ethnographic fieldwork, historical research, and close object study. Now, as a museum director, he has the challenge to put his scholarly experience and theoretical sophistication into practice, a profile that has landed him on the advisory boards of such major ethnographic museums as the Musée de Quai Branly in Paris and the Humboldt Forum being developed as we speak in Berlin. Tonight, we will be treated to some of his current musings on the potential for museums and the revived role of curiosity in the 21st century. In his range of disciplinary methods, in his deep knowledge of eclectic museum collections, In the global scope of his purview and in the diversity of his institutional moorings, he is a fitting recipient of this year's Iris Foundation Award. Please join me in welcoming back to the BGC Professor Nicholas Thomas.
Thanks, Aaron. It's a great honour to be here. It's also a great pleasure to be here. For those of us in the UK who work on material culture, on the art anthropology, art history nexus, I think the BGC is a sort of home away from home. It's somewhere I always enjoy visiting and participating in the very rich conversations that go on around here. As Aaron signalled, since 2006 I've been a museum practitioner as well as a commentator on cross-cultural art histories, and that's been an interesting and challenging experience that I'm in the process of trying to reflect on and consider. This talk is out of a book in progress on the same title. I hope it's not too unprocessed right at the moment. It's also a book that aspires to reach people beyond the field to try to capture some of the developments in the present. I'm a little concerned that this particular audience is full of immensely learned insiders for whom much of what I have to say may be rather obvious. I hope anyway that it's obvious in an interesting way. Museums make grand claims to represent the natural world, to narrate civilization, to survey the arts. Even on a more local scale, there may be much at stake in a promise to tell the story of a district or a town. So it's not surprising that for as long as they've been around, they've had both advocates and detractors. Over the last decades of the 20th century, their detractors were most vocal. It was a period marked by mounting criticism of museums by commentators and scholars from many disciplines, as well as by a succession of often damaging public controversies. They were lambasted variously as temples of elite culture, warehouses of colonial loot, and as hegemonic institutions, instruments of the state created to inculcate ideologies and hierarchies. This was part and parcel of the late 20th century sea change in the humanities, marked by political and philosophical challenges to traditional methods, disciplines, and the cultural canon. But there were also broader shifts that seemed to erode the status of the museum. In the field of art, for example, the vital new practices were site-specific, on the body, performative, and public. If art museums have since found ways of representing and canonizing the corporeal and ephemeral, it seemed for a time that these practices neither needed nor wanted the traditional institutions. And as digital and online media emerged in the 1990s, museums appeared just too static, just too physical to be vital presences within the emerging environment. Many people had, in any case, long thought of museums as places for dead things. In the 50s, the Frankfurt School philosopher Theodor Adorno referred to the unpleasant overtones of the German adjective museal that referred to objects in the process of dying. Chris Marker's and Alan René's 1953 film essay, Les statues meurent aussi, rendered the proposition anti-colonial. From an opposed political position, Margaret Thatcher said much the same thing in the 1980s, by which time museums were thought to be dying themselves. When the historian and theorist Gyan Prakash wrote in 1996 that a sense prevails today that museums have become history, finished, exhausted, lifeless, this was surely spot on, as an evocation of the commentary of the period. In hindsight, it's hard to think of another context in which scholars and cultural critics have been quite so badly wrong-footed. The last 20 to 30 years have not witnessed the obsolescence, the redundancy, or the decline of the museum. To the contrary, the period has been one of almost supercharged renewal, and the process was already well and truly underway when Prakash diagnosed exhaustion. It's unhelpful to argue that there was any single moment or turning point when museums came to be seen or seen again as vital and fertile places. The history has been too uneven to be narrated in those terms. Yet among landmark events must be counted the inauguration of the Centre Georges Pompidou in Paris in 1977. The building's radical architectural concept exemplified the claim of democratization, the pitch for a new audience, facilitated by the openness of the Place Beaubourg, the museum's situation in the midst of a café quartier. An 18-year-old Australian in Paris for the first time, I happened to visit the Pompidou within a year of its opening in the spring of 1978. Some combination of Henri Michaud's esoteric inscriptions, the centre's second temporary exhibition, a light-headed mood the morning after a long party, my impressionable nature at the time made the place seem not just cool, but a point of entry into a new world. I was certainly unsophisticated, but I suspect far from alone among young people at the time who found the Pompidou considerably more enticing than the aloof facades we associated with the Standard Art Gallery. The new museum was an architectural event, an architectural movement to which museology itself would, in fits and starts, play catch-up. Over the period since, governments, foundations and sponsors of all kinds have spent an unprecedented amount of time, money and energy on museums. The closing decades of the 19th century and those of the early 20th saw the establishment of many great city, university and state collections in Europe, North America and elsewhere, but the proliferation of new, extended, renovated and rehoused institutions over the last 20 or so years has amounted to something else again. The sheer number of art galleries, science, history, archaeology and world cultures museums has increased dramatically, as has that of local heritage, single site, special interest and other quirky smaller museums. So moreover has the scale of activity, blockbusters, biennales and busy events, programs of business as usual, and even smaller institutions mount changing displays, offer concerts and talks in galleries, run programs for schools and friends' evenings, make collections accessible online, and try to build constituencies through social media. The phenomenon of museum growth has been energized from the bottom up as well as the top down. Among instances of this wave of development that might be cited, Canada, New Zealand and Australia are among many countries in which new museums of the nation have been created, opening in 1989, 98 and 2001 respectively. Each of these societies had been, and still are, engaged in a protracted and painful reassessment of dealings between settlers and Indigenous peoples, and the new museum's many tasks included the reimagining of national histories. All have had moments of controversy, but proved considerably more popular than forecast. In Paris, new national art museums such as the Quai d'Orsay and Quai Branly have been successfully established, bringing the number in the city to 150. 700 journalists attended the press preview of the reopening following a decade of reconstruction of the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam. During his March 2014 visit, Barack Obama was photographed contemplating Rembrandt's self-portrait as the Apostle Paul of 1661, as if carefully advertising the precious moment of reflection that the art museum offers those leading the busiest of possible lives. In Berlin, a series of relocations and renovations have reconstituted the Museum Inzell in the Spree. One of Europe's largest current museum development projects involves the creation of the Humboldt Forum, a world cultures institution, on the nearby site of the former Schloss Palace. The foundation of a museum island on the Berlin model has become an aspiration of city leaders, whether or not they have to hand a literal island for the purpose. In London, the Tate evolved from a single site institution to a consortium dominated by Tate Modern, one of 3 most visited tourist attractions in the country, now undergoing major expansion. In the 19th century, the business of museum making was largely the province of the Western and settler colonies, though the establishment of national art and national history museums in what were at the time the prosperous Creole nations of Argentina and Brazil and Chile from 1818 onwards should not be overlooked. The Indian Museum in Calcutta recently celebrated its bicentenary. Institutions in Egypt were established from 1835 on, and in Japan from the 1870s. Today, the geographic distribution of projects of museum making is very uneven, but there are hotspots scattered around the globe. A recent Chinese government 5-year plan sought to bring the number of museums in the country to 3,500, a target achieved naturally several years ahead of schedule. In the Emirates, collaborations with the Louvre and the British Museum promise the creation of museums of art and civilization on the grandest scale. These partnerships have proven lucrative for the European partners. Abu Dhabi paid $525 million merely for the right to use the Louvre brand, while fees for curatorial advice and loans bring the overall value of the deal to around €1 billion. The British Museum's collaboration with the Zayed National Museum is more limited in scope, but is believed nevertheless to be worth some $10 million a year. The conditions of employment of the primarily South Asian labour force have made these projects controversial. They've also attracted the scrutiny of the Lebanese artist Walid Raad, whose playful but serious works around the theme include evocations of strangely vacant, hypermonumental spaces and prints of artefacts superimposed such that their qualities are confused and their captions illegible. New museums, grand developments, and more visitors are not aspects of a single trend, but of related trends manifested differently and unevenly in different environments. Nor does success, however judged, necessarily indicate that all the varied critiques of museums were simply wrong. The argument of Pierre Bourdieu and Alain Darbel's L'amour de l'art, an influential account of the propensity of art museums to reinforce the confidence and status of the privileged while conversely disempowering others, was probably apt for the period the surveys upon which it was based were undertaken in the early to mid-60s and for a good many years afterwards. If it's less so today, that's precisely because such arguments motivated change. Governments has gone as far as providing funding dependent on increasing engagement on the part of less affluent social groups. And in England, by 2012 and 13, public participation in the cultural sector passed a symbolic mark in the sense that over half of all adults visited a museum or gallery during the year. Even the figure for lower socioeconomic groups reached just under 40%. These, like most statistics, are no more than uncontextualised indicators. They also reflect the singularity of the UK in the sense that since 2000, free general admission has become the norm. If in societies marked not merely by persistent but growing inequality, there can be no complacency about the challenges of increasing access, we've nevertheless witnessed a sea change. In the curatorial sphere, the poachers have become gamekeepers, some among the students of the 70s, 80s and 90s who were fired up by debates around racism, Indigenous rights, multiculturalism and empire, are now museum directors, others senior policy makers or managers of funding agencies. The sense of urgency around engaging communities, provoked initially by Aboriginal claims and the politics of redress and reconciliation, as well as by the scope for greatly enriching understanding of Indigenous art forms and traditions through knowledge sharing, was generalised across not only museum milieu, but the wider heritage and cultural sectors. In the United Kingdom, the Heritage Lottery Fund, which directs the proceeds of state-sponsored gambling to projects such as museum redevelopment, understands community empowerment as central to its mission. We want more people and a broader range of people to take an active part in heritage, is how a recent document put it. What had been an oppositional argument is now firmly enshrined in the sector's governance and planning. All this is to say that the image of the museum in the museum studies literature and in wider commentary, still that of a more or less illegitimate institution struggling to respond to challenges to its authority, has not caught up with the ways museums have moved on. If, to be sure, some remain what they were, for better or worse, the broader trend has seen institutions growing, proliferating, diversifying, and becoming more inclusive and effective, reflecting a host of factors ranging from broader economic and political trends, the continuing growth of tourism, the devolution of planning and finance to regions and cities, widening participation in higher education, through contemporary arts transformation into a form of popular culture, and hence a powerful point of access into history and science collections, as well as a driver of the popularity of museums of art themselves, to internal professional developments in museum education, exhibition marketing, curatorial practice, and digital development. I can't review all of these dimensions of museum reinvigoration, but want to raise the question of what museums actually offer, not for policymakers, city planners, and economists, but for the diverse range of people who spend time in them. My answers are inspired by what museums contain, that is, collections. But it makes sense to start with what may be more familiar responses that should be acknowledged here. The chair of a leading arts charity recently stated that museums offered their visitors enjoyment, education, and importantly also spiritual uplift, the sense of wonder and even elation that a person may feel encountering a work of art that is beautiful or otherwise profoundly impressive or moving. Notwithstanding the critique of aesthetics that provided the departure point for so much 20th century theory, broad claims of this sort embrace important truths. Images and artifacts may be powerfully affecting. They can indeed palpably lift people's spirits. Visitors may be entranced or intrigued or struck or otherwise stimulated not only by artworks but by relic specimens and artifacts of many kinds. Museums are said also to express the character of places and the identities of communities and provide a sense of history, of deeper cultural roots. Yet, if these sorts of claims deserve consideration, they're unspecific. It could equally be said that theatre or music, reading a novel, even participation in a religious service may all be enjoyable, perhaps educational. They may all provide spiritual uplift and may all also connect their audiences with history or local identity. What's distinctive? It's ironic that museums are now said, as if interchangeably, to be engaging with visitors or audiences and to be concerned with audience development. The word's etymology relates, needless to say, to hearing. An audience with a pope or king was an opportunity to be heard, and even if the word is commonly used now to refer to any target, constituency or market, we still associate an audience first and foremost with a play, a concert or lecture. Obvious it may be, performances of this sort are very different in nature to exhibitions or museums. It's worth reflecting upon precisely how a museum visit is singular relative to other kinds of participation in cultural activities. Although the guided tour stands as a significant exception, the museum visitor is not typically part of a constituted group who gather to hear or witness a coherent program or performance that occupies a specific time. The point's not that the one implies passivity and the other activity. Play and concert goers may watch and listen actively, sometimes assertively, but they hear and witness the same show that presupposes a focus of attention, the action, dialogue, or performance on the stage, and has not only a given duration, but a conventional temporal order, a series of movements and pieces, scenes and acts, an interval, applause, possibly an encore, a series that is at once anticipated and respected by the audience, as well as the performance, whose engagement and mood is modulated as the program progresses. The museum visit neither falls within a specific part of the day, nor does it have a defined duration. If museum architecture, lighting, display furniture, scenography and so forth encourage particular ways of seeing and otherwise enable or constrain the visitor, there's nothing in the museum visit that's quite like theatre seating that orients the audience as if to facilitate its attention for the duration of a defined performance event. A museum visit is, in contrast, more like a walk through a building, often through its courtyards or precincts, admittedly a special kind of walk through a building of a singular kind, punctuated by encounters with objects, yet with no fixed focus. Most importantly, and within whatever happens to be the scope of the particular museum, its content is weakly scripted. Even if displays are intended to convey, or visitors bring, ideological baggage of all kinds, ranging from hierarchies of value through national narrative to cultural stereotypes, the mutable and numerous itineraries available through larger institutions, the visitor's capacity to focus on what interests them and pass over what doesn't, and the evocative and ambiguous nature of artefacts all conspire against the prescription of interpretation. This is certainly less true of museums dedicated to specific topics, like the Apartheid Museum in Johannesburg or the various Holocaust memorial museums that provided models for it. But I hope that there's a point to this line of argument for broader museums of art, culture, history, and science, if not for what might be called story-specific exhibitions. If, from one angle, a museum visit differs from going to a play in the same way that dipping into an encyclopedia differs from reading a novel from start to finish, the one entailing eclectic sampling, the other obedience to a narrative, it's again obvious but again consequential that exhibitions differ from both encyclopedias and novels, from books of all kinds, not only in this relationship to temporality, but also in that their vital elements are physical things, specimens, paintings, installations, artifacts. An exhibition can, of course, consist of books, in which case we're reminded that books aren't just texts, but a form of material culture with their distinctive binding, paper, typography and design that speak their period, aspirations and intended circulation among the affluent or the masses, or maybe a highly singular story of ownership, reading and use. This Shakespeare, shown at the end of the British Museum's 2012 exhibition, Shakespeare Staging the World, was shared among fellow prisoners on Robben Island, some of whom identified and signed their favourite passages. Cowards die many times before their deaths. The valiant never taste of death but once, seeing that death a necessary end will come when it will come. Lines from Julius Caesar, Act 2, Scene 2 are marked here by Nelson Mandela as if to prompt recollection of the last resonant words of his own treason trial speech. Even in this case of an exhibition animated by text and speech, it matters that displays are made out of things. Here, at the Bard Graduate Centre, one line of argument that I can take for granted, I think, that I need not rehearse, draws out the contradictory qualities of material culture. Artefacts bear at once specific forms and purposes and seem endlessly susceptible to recontextualization. Their histories enable them to speak at once of then and there and here and now. They exhibit a paradox of physical immediacy and manifold identity. Hence, in the museum setting, material culture may be telling and bring remarkable and unexpected connections into view between Shakespeare and one of the 20th century's great liberation struggles, for example, but artefacts are typically also suggestive in manifold ways. They're almost positively unprescriptive. They give you a push into a space in which you can move and think. The debates about the politics of exhibitions that have preoccupied commentators, curators and activists over the last 30 or so years have been of vital importance, but have passed over seemingly simple questions such as, what do museums contain? What they contain, in most instances, are collections. What they exhibit are samples of those collections, and what they do behind the scenes, out of public view, is called collections care. Much of what's embraced by the term is practical and technical. It involves appropriate packing and pest control, for example. Yet, as with children or the elderly, care has many dimensions. It involves a capacious, costly, and contentious set of responsibilities. It may be clear that preserving an object in storage requires suitable racking and environmental monitoring, but if an artefact or specimen can't be said to be cared for if curators don't know they have it, if it can't be located, or if it's otherwise miscatalogued. Care is therefore, right from the start, a matter of knowledge and identification, as well as an effort to manage physical risks. Day-to-day, curators and collection staff are often involved in managing loans for temporary and touring exhibitions. Most people who go to blockbusters or more modest shows have no notion of the elaborate and protracted diplomacy that may be required to bring together the works on the walls or in cases around them. These sorts of negotiations weigh up the significance and fragility of remarkable objects. They entail subtle and not so subtle negotiation, diplomatic and political agendas, and sometimes a lot of money. In a more low-key fashion, curators adjust or refresh displays and spend time bringing pieces out from storage for study by researchers and community members, perhaps the descendants of the original creators, collectors or donors. These are not just occasions for dispassionate analysis or observation, they're often affecting encounters, especially but not exclusively when people have ancestral connections with the works or relics in question. What we might call a positivist conception of the collection, an identity associated with its definite physical existence, will not take us very far. Hundreds of thousands, even millions of artefacts or specimens don't constitute the collection any more than a physical territory of, say, 7.7 million square kilometres or a population of, say, 22 million people constitute a nation. A nation is a complex institutional and political entity, a form of governance, as well as an imagined and contested community, a narrative. Without pushing the analogy, a collection is likewise made up of complex associations, connections, and representations. These relations, in turn, are of a number of kinds, some literal and amenable to straightforward description, others more at the level of conception or imagination, yet not necessarily less consequential for being so. Among the more literal, we can point to relations between objects, which form distinct groups and series. A group of zoological specimens may all have been collected on the same expedition or by the same naturalist over a series of expeditions, and a group of photographs by a connoisseur over a lifetime of acquisition. Such associations appear simple enough, but may be doubly incomplete and overdetermined. 4 spears in Cambridge were appropriated by Captain Cook and his companions from an Aboriginal camp not far from the water's edge on the south shore of Botany Bay, within a short time of the navigator's first Australian landing on the 29th of April 1770. Joseph Banks' journal indicates that a much larger number of spears, some 40 to 50, were picked up because some had earlier been thrown at the Europeans as they attempted to land, and it was feared that their tips were poisoned. This was not so much collecting as disarmament. What happened to the rest is not known. Some may have been destroyed, others might well have reached other museums, yet without documentation linking them to the Endeavour's voyage. The relationship of such pieces, if indeed they are extant, to an event of foundational historical significance is latent, but susceptible relationship with a cousin of whose existence you may be ignorant to eventual discovery. A drawing made soon after the voyage by a draftsman employed by Joseph Banks is a proof that representative examples were considered significant. It also helps establish that a shield in the British Museum was obtained on the same occasion. Indeed, it's clear from Banks' notes that it was picked up by one of the Aboriginal men who'd thrown spears to defend himself. When the intruders opened fire, he dropped it as he withdrew. These quotidian things are related to each other and above all to the inauspicious inauguration of the relationship between the British and Indigenous Australians in a singularly specific sense. They were acquired not incidentally, but as part of the practice of seeing off local resistance to the landing. The multi-pronged fish spear seems intimately apt to the shallow sandy waters of Botany Bay, and just too ordinary an instrument of subsistence to bear the narrative of continental colonisation that we inevitably now associate it with. Objects bear direct relationships to inscriptions, labels, entries in accession registers, catalogue cards, and now to online documentation. They may also be related to images, citations, casts, and replicas of other kinds. They're related to people, their makers, collectors, and successive owners. It may seem improbable that relationships between relics of whatever sort, people long dead, or people who may never have seen or touched them are real and consequential, but their management may be delicate and their mismanagement may bring about a crisis. In New Zealand, a bitter dispute in 2009 between the Auckland Museum and the children of Sir Edmund Hillary, who had bequeathed materials to the institution, was resolved only following the intervention of the country's Prime Minister, and loomed large among issues that soon afterwards compelled the director concerned to resign. If collections are made up by a bewildering variety of relations, what they speak most vitally are human intentions. Consider J.M.W. Turner, at the age of 27 already wealthy, considered the outstanding British artist of his generation and a Royal Academician. The artist opened Turner's Gallery, adjunct to his own city house, not far north of the department stores and fashion outlets that now line Oxford Street. Here he was able to order works as he wished, as he could not do in the crowded displays at the Royal Academy. He went on to refurbish the gallery, not as a showcase for new work, but as a museum displaying a representative range of his major paintings, and he formed the intention of presenting the collection to the nation. In order to constitute that bequest as he conceived it, he not only refrained from selling certain works, but actually bought others back that he had previously sold. While the collection's history following the artist's death in 1851 is complex, the eventual inauguration in 1987 of the Claw Gallery, a wing of what's now Tate Britain, specifically to house the bequest, amounted to a huge step forwards towards meeting Turner's own wishes, according to Sandy Nan. Collections are doubly effects of and evidence for past intentions, in this case those of an artist with not only a vehement sense of his own place in British art history, but an interest in the nature and ambitions of art institutions, such as the National Gallery, which had opened in 1838. If the claw exemplifies a sense in which an individual's intentions may sometimes have remarkable effect over the long term, it could be seen as an exception that proves the rule. Collections more typically result from layered and intersecting intentions. Among the pieces from the Kingdom of Uganda at MAA in Cambridge is a brass necklet worn by a royal bodyguard. Apollo Kagwa, born in 1864, died in 1927, was Katakiro, a prime minister of the kingdom and for many years regent in place of the young heir. One of the Church Missionary Society's earliest converts, he was also a friend of the prominent missionary John Roscoe, whose 1911 book, The Baganda, is considered a classic survey of customary life, though it actually owed a great deal to Kagwa's own extensive writings on history and folklore and drew on interviews with elders that the two men conducted jointly. It was during a 1902 visit to England with his private secretary to attend the coronation of King Edward VII that Kagwa visited Roscoe in Cambridge and presented the necklet and 16 other pieces to the museum, where they're cared for alongside Roscoe's more extensive donation. When Kagwa assembled the group of pieces ahead of his trip to England, he was thinking diplomatically. He planned to leave the artefacts with appropriate recipients there and may have had the museum in mind from the start. In November 1961, in the lead up to Ugandan independence, Abu Mayanja, Minister for Education, wrote to Cambridge's Vice-Chancellor seeking the repatriation of the historic relics from the Uganda Kingdom that were held at MAA and singling out the regalia of the war god Kibuka. A Cambridge graduate and a barrister, Mayanja expressed himself judiciously. We're not disputing the legal title of of Cambridge to these relics, although it's doubtful whether Sir Apollo had the right to give them away. On the contrary, we're very grateful to the university for having preserved them. Our request is rather that you will consider sympathetically our great interest in these things, especially now that Uganda is about to regain her independence. He also emphasised that the facilities at the National Museum were adequate and that the objects would not only be preserved safely but would remain accessible to scientific inquirers and others. The museum's committee, chaired at the time by Jack Goody, and eminent Africanists, were indeed sympathetic so far as unique and sacred objects were concerned. What he referred to as the general ethnological collection, on the other hand, was said to be of great value in Cambridge for teaching purposes. Anyway, they believed it consisted mainly of objects already represented in the Uganda National Collection. But in due course, the Kibuka relics went back to Kampala in Mayanja's suitcase. They've since been on display in the Uganda Museum, though Kibuka followers have repeatedly called for the sacred objects to be handed over to them for cult purposes, and in November 2007 a crowd stormed the institution intending to seize the relics. Though they were prevented from doing so, the issue remains alive, and in part to forestall any renewed attempt, armed guards are routinely present at the public entrance. Kagwa, Roscoe and Mayanja, like J.M.W. Turner, were all interested in placing things in museums, institutions that had national or scientific status, or both. In 1961, there was a question, soon succeeded by a consensus, that the appropriate museum for the relics, though not the collection as a whole, was in Kampala rather than Cambridge. The more enduring and bitter contention since has been about whether they should be in a museum at all, and the thwarted intentions of those cult followers are now part of the definition of that collection as palpably as those of the Greek people and government with respect to the Elgin marbles. Understandings not only of the collection but of the artefact have suffered from a certain naturalism. Especially but not exclusively in ethnography collections, it's assumed that the objects in museums sample the material cultures that people actually had and used, that they were extracted from the organic flow of community use. Many works in museums indeed did have contexts, as we call them, in people's lives, and these include not only African and Oceanic works that were formerly caught up in the heat and dust of dance, but paintings that were once in churches or in domestic settings. Yet just as other paintings and artworks were conceived for public institutions, a far greater proportion of indigenous works in museums were made for collectors, and indeed specifically for museums, than is commonly understood. The great German museums for Volkerkunde that assembled their holdings in the closing decades of the 19th century and the period before World War I, in part through undertaking large-scale state-sponsored expeditions, are replete with model houses and canoes made on commission for the ethnographers who took home big things but could mostly not purchase or pack the full-scale originals. Collections also include figures with representations of tattoos or appropriately scaled articles of dress. None of these samples of things None of these were samples of things that their communities habitually made or used. They were novel creations, products of the cross-cultural encounter and of collecting itself, which looks less like a moment of appropriation and more a space of redefinition and invention. It could be added, with respect to natural history museums, that the birds, plants and fossils that one may encounter in displays and draws are emphatically not natural specimens, but artful creations. Among practitioners, the word preparation is used to refer to the rendering of residue in stone, a plant cutting or a dead creature in a suitably revelatory, visually dramatic, or in the case of taxidermy, paradoxically still but lifelike form. When I first encountered the dodo skeleton in Cambridge's Zoology Museum, I assumed that what I looked at was the skeleton of a particular dodo, whereas this is in fact an assemblage made from the bones of many individual birds that were gathered by islanders on commission from local naturalists from the deep mud of the swamp known aptly as the Mar au Songe in southeastern Mauritius. Beyond the naturalisms of heritage, the collection and the artifact, the museum becomes visible not just as an edifice or institution, but as a method and a form of activity. Curators typically identify themselves in disciplinary terms. They're art historians, archaeologists, or paleontologists. But insofar as their research is museum-based, its discipline is curatorial. It starts with objects, with material culture in the distinctively assembled form of the collection, and finds inspiration, insight, or knowledge in some sense through the collection. If the world of research embraces a bewildering range of methods, there's nevertheless something peculiar, that is, both distinctive and odd, about that of the museum, which begins less with discourse or theory, with a problem inherited or framed, than simply with objects. This is, in one sense, unremarkable. It's the contingency of dealing with things, but in another sense, it represents a method at once hesitant and powerful, reminiscent of the Rings of Saturn, Sebald's bewildering, reflective narrative of a walk around the Suffolk coast, past neglected seaside resorts, obscure stately homes, and abandoned railways. Sebald was preoccupied with the vestiges of lost lives and the horror of forgotten histories of violence and exploitation. The Rings of Saturn are the frozen fragments of former worlds. But there's something inspiring in his capacity to discover in the artifacts and sites that he comes upon, seemingly at random, out of the way histories that complicate our understandings of the present. This carving is one of 3 Maori pieces in Cambridge, collected by Baron Karl von Hugel, an aristocratic Austrian soldier and diplomat, renowned for his botany and gardening. There's a park named after him in the suburbs of Vienna. In the late 1820s, he was engaged to a Hungarian princess said to be one of the great beauties of the age, who then became the 3rd wife of the great Austrian statesman Prince Metternich, who was a family friend of von Hugel's. He dealt with his apparently acute distress by embarking upon an extended voyage through Kashmir and what was Ceylon in the early 1830s that resulted in major publications and vast collections of natural history specimens, as well as coins and other rarities, in due course presented to the state museums in Vienna. Von Hugel's single long voyage included a period in Australia and a short visit, but one rich in encounter, to the Bay of Islands in northern New Zealand. During this period, in March 1834, von Hugel spent a good deal of time in the company of William Yate of the Church Missionary Society, a gifted linguist, an enthusiastic student of Maori culture, and author of one of the earliest insightful commentaries on Maori tiki, objects of personal adornment that he recognised were powerful memorializations of deceased kin. He proudly entertained the aristocratic traveller and presented him with pieces from his own collection, what has recently been renamed the Weltmuseum in Vienna, holds some 40 Pacific objects donated by Carl von Hugel that no doubt include most of those he was given by Yate. A few, however, were retained in the family. 60 years later, Carl's son, Anatole von Hugel, had undertaken his own long Pacific voyage, in part a project of piety, made extensive collections, especially in Fiji, been subsequently appointed the founding curator of what was then the Museum of Archaeology and Ethnology in Cambridge, and in the course of vigorously enlarging the collections, deposited the 3 pieces his father had obtained. The work is a teko-teko, an apical carving from the facade of a house. This type was probably from or intended for a larger, impressive building and has characteristics associated with a pataka or food store rather than a meeting house. Robert Yonke of Massey University, among those most knowledgeable about 19th century Maori carving, has examined the sculpture and noted first of all that it's fully consistent with the Te Arawa style, that of the region around Rotorua in the centre of the North Island. Secondly, that the surface decoration on the lower part's unfinished. And third, that the naturalistic approach to the fingers and hands is an innovation of the 1830s, not found in carvings of just a decade or so earlier, such as another of the pieces that von Hugel obtained, now also in Cambridge. Whereas this slightly older work in the style of the East Coast was perhaps among those given to von Hugel by Yate, the Te Arawa piece is likely to have been newly carved at the time of his visit. It may be the work of a man von Hugel called the Lame Tattooist, whom he met several times and exchanged gifts with. On first sighting Maori men, he'd been repelled by their famous or notorious involuted facial tattoos, but confessed that he quickly came to admire the inimitable boldness of the art, and even had this man inflict a small sample tattoo on his own arm. The Lame Tattooist was also a carver and presented the naturalist with at least one of his works, possibly this one, a piece he was working on that therefore was unfinished. The work, being in the Te Arawa style rather than that of the area itself, reflects the decades of turbulence prior to this particular encounter. Traders had been visiting the region since the 1790s. Local competition and conflict had intensified. Most crucially, the warrior chief Hongi Hika had visited England and Australia and imported firearms on an unprecedented scale. The musket wars of the 1820s were marked by sustained invasions of Te Arawa territory, and so-called slaves were taken in considerable numbers and resettled among the tribes of the north. Those captives included a good many carvers, perhaps including the Lame Tattooist, and by 1830 the art tradition, particular to the north, had been all but abandoned, the work of carving being given to these subordinate or assimilated Te Arawa instead. The sculpture's authorship and acquisition history can't be absolutely specified. It may or may not have been this man's work. It may have been given to von Hugel directly. It may have been acquired first by Yate. But we do know for sure that it was a product of these meetings, this milieu, and that its unfinished state reflects the first of its recontextualizations, the work's Maori maker taking the view that what he'd started, an incarnation of an ancestor intended to speak iwi authority from an elevated architectural setting, might rather be gifted, traded, sent to Europe. Over 2005 to 6, an exhibition was developed at MAA, which parenthetically I take no credit for. It was curated by Rosanna Raymond and Amy Salmon prior to my appointment. It was entitled Pacifica Styles. It brought New Zealand artists to the museum and enabled them to respond to specific works and to the institutional context. Lisa Rehana, who's a prominent filmmaker and video artist, was among the group, and she created work related to Hongi Hika's visit to Cambridge, since he'd come and helped the linguist Ray prepare an early Maori grammar, but also this piece that incorporated the teko-teko collected in 1834 by Carl von Hugel. Her project bore a symmetrical relationship to an act of repatriation. She undertook extensive filming and gathered a variety of audio materials, a Maori choir, tap-tapping sounds as the carver, Lionel Grant, carves a pattern found on the mouth of this piece onto another work of his own. She wrote, "The teko-tekos erected inside a vitrine, contextualized by sounds and images of home." On it are 1960s headphones, and when the viewer listens to the Nokia phones, that is to handsets attached to the display, the combination of the two, visually and conceptually, evokes conversing with this ancestor. Lisa will say lightheartedly that she has a thing about the clunky design of 60s and 70s technology, but the inclusion of handsets with coiled leads that telephones before the cordless kind always had also recalls for her grandmother's work in the local telephone exchange up in that northern part of the country. The work stages a deliberate disconnect. Had the project been simply to enliven the figure in the present, the artist could have introduced the ubiquitous earphones we associate with iPods or other new headphones. Often we relate to artworks by associating them in some way with our lives or interests. Christianity or Islam may connect us with works of religious art. Paintings may represent places we inhabit or have visited. And there are many other personal, biographic, and idiosyncratic kinds of associations that make artifacts and images present to us, that bring them home to us. If Heitau Toko is evidently concerned at once to bring home to the teko-teko and to bring this work from the past to life now, the artist would seem to have him inhabit not our own time, right now, but a time within the span of our own lives, yet one contemporaneous with her childhood in the 60s and 70s. Which is to say that ancestral art forms may indeed be things that we can make our own, but we have them rather as we have our own lives that are made up of earlier and more recent passages, the former prone to become to recede and to become less familiar to us. Since 1995, Brooke Andrew has been visiting and studying anthropological collections in Australia, the United Kingdom, and elsewhere. His interest has been in bringing old and obscure images of Indigenous people into the light. His term, an early prize-winning work rendered one man sexy and dangerous. More recently, the mood of these works has typically been more elusive and enigmatic. Andrew has responded most recently to collections associated with William Blandowski, a natural historian in the tradition of von Humboldt, who arrived in Australia in 1849 and began to make a name for himself in scientific circles. Over 1856 to 7, he led an expedition to the confluence of the Murray and Darling rivers, a region then little known to white settlers. He gathered a massive collection of new natural specimens on the basis, he was happy to acknowledge, of close collaboration with the Ngari people, whose activities and ceremonies were studied and depicted by the expedition artist Gerard Krefft. On his return to Melbourne, Blandowski was initially feted but swiftly caught up in controversy and compelled to return to Europe. Over 1860 to 61, he employed a draftsman to rework Krefft's drawings, together with illustrations from other sources, and planned an ambitious visual encyclopedia. But he failed to gain financial backing, and only 2 copies of the album, Australian in 142 Fotografischen, are known today to exist, one in the Staatsbibliothek Berlin and the other in Cambridge. In addition, some 300 faded and flimsy copy prints are in MAA's photographic archive, and it was these that Brooke Andrew came across and was immediately excited by when he first visited the museum in June 2007. Only a couple of weeks later, back in Australia, he wrote to me requesting high-resolution scans that he would manipulate and develop, and within 6 months he'd begun producing a series of works on a spectacular scale, just under 10 feet wide and over 8 high. Blandowski's title was misleading. No doubt he hoped to capitalise on photography's status at the time as an advanced technology with a unique capacity to represent nature. But the album was made up of photographs of drawings derived from a variety of sources, including illustrations in earlier exploratory works. The representation of the burial mound was adapted from the frontispiece of Charles Sturt's Two Expeditions into the Interior of Southern Australia of 1833. The image was thus at some remove from field sketches that might themselves have been imaginative or inaccurate. Yet, in however distorted a fashion, the colonial imagery acknowledged an Indigenous Australian landscape architecture, an aesthetic represented also in the carved trees surrounding what was essentially a mortuary monument. Hence, the obscure print stands as an affirmation of customary culture that Andrews' work literally magnifies to billboard scale with commensurate claims upon the attention of the public. In Australia, these works aroused great interest, were critically discussed in arts journals, acquired by several of the major state galleries, exhibited and toured. I cite Rehana's and Andrews' work here, not because I'm seeking to add to the now 20-year-old discussion regarding contemporary artists' interventions in museums. Both projects draw attention to the sense in which the collection is not only a relational assembly in manifold senses, it's also a creative technology, something that can be used to make new things, such as works of contemporary art that can be internationally circulated and shown and sold. I'm interested in this context, not in the distinctiveness of these and other artists' projects, but their affinity with the uses visitors of all kinds make of museums. It's notable now that people all the time take visual notes with their smartphones that they may post and share, captioned by any sort of observation, a comment on the composition of the thing, a political remark, a silly joke. These expressions via social media only make visible ways of using collections that have always been significant, connecting things, forming ideas and representations that previously had lives in notebooks, in conversations, even just in private thoughts. The collection has long been a creative technology for the practice of object illustration, at once intimately attentive to material culture, yet indifferent to its curatorial ordering and interpretation. More or less frequently, in higher education, the drive to focus investment in STEM subjects, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, and the reduction of support for the arts and social sciences is debated and lamented. Too often, advocates of the humanities are content to argue, with more or less elaboration, that the arts are good because they are good. There's another kind of argument, that the real world of our social and economic lives demands much sensitivity to culture and difference in both the multicultural milieu the vast majority of people now locally inhabit and in the regional, national and international relationships we all need to initiate and sustain, whatever kind of work we may be engaged in. In this context, society needs not only technical expertise and powerful calculation, but also interpretive and analytical acuity. While a British Education Secretary once dismissed medieval history as a subject that might be sustained to ornament the offerings of one or two universities, it's in fact precisely the kind of discipline that enables people to go the distance conceptually, to acknowledge alternate visions of rights, value, and efficacy, to consider the consequences of acting or failing to act. Advocates of museums have long argued that the institutions address societal needs in terms that may be broadly apt, but that are often excessively instrumental. If such capacity as museums may have to foster cosmopolitan citizenship is of enormous value, Their deeper effectivity may arise not from their particular disciplinary orientation or content, but from the very fact that we cannot predict or prescribe what visitors make of them. Whether young or old, people enter collections and ask apparently simple questions, such as, what is it? What's it for? Why is it here? Should it be here? And so on. This curiosity, this questioning, fosters skills, and in particular an ability to engage and respond to difference that we might consider a survival skill in the connected but heterogeneous, dangerous but fragile world we inhabit. Many institutions, sites and experiences, of course, help people acquire skills of various kinds, but the museum promises something distinctive, a place and space richly peopled by works and things, a realm in which you can pursue interest and discover interests you didn't know you had. That's what, for all their faults, museums may be good for in our time.
Thank you very much, Nick, for that very wide-ranging and provocative talk. The floor is open for questions, and we'll be checking the Twitter feed, too, for any questions that get sent remotely.
Thank you for a very rich and stimulating talk. It cast me back to last Friday when we were here thinking about the chance of revitalizing university art museums. And I just wonder, since you're in one, but your talk raises questions that are applicable to so many broader types of museums, what do you see in your capacity as the special opportunities or obligations of a university-centered museum? I won't say art museum, but a university-centered museum in relationship to some of the themes that you presented tonight.
Well, university museums are themselves, of course, very diverse, and they include, art museums that are on a public museum scale. I think that of a smaller to medium-sized museum of the kind I work in has the privilege of perhaps having a certain versatility that major institutions don't have. We don't have the capacity to charge for temporary exhibitions, for example, and that means we program things because we think they represent stimulating projects. We don't have to select some things because people might come or exclude other things because they might not. And there's also a capacity to respond to someone who may be an interesting postdoc and to do something small, whereas of course in a very major departmentalized city or national museum you can't really program quite in that way. Of course we also do think that we're full of interesting people working away at ideas, and that presence makes a difference and empowers us. But of course there are bigger museums who have terrific researchers in them as well.
This has to do with the part of your talk that had to do with museum goers' responses to the exhibit. Having done an exhibit many years ago, I was quite surprised to find out that museum didn't do what I would classically call market research. Find out what the responses of the viewers of the exhibits were. I don't know whether this is being done now, but it would seem to me that it's important to understand the messages which are coming across, because this then enables you to organize your exhibits in a way in terms of what you want to communicate.
Yes, and I think that's one of the areas that has become very much more dramatically professionalized over the last 20 years, and funding agencies, whether for a new gallery or an exhibition project, wouldn't give you the money now unless they thought you were engaging in that sort of consultation and evaluation in a reasonably rigorous way. I'm not sure if it always makes a difference or should make a difference to what one thinks of doing.
Sometimes you have a message in mind, and what's being conveyed is something totally different.
I suppose what I was trying to get across was, in a sense, that doesn't really matter. I think people can go into exhibitions and get, in a sense, sort of grab the ball and run with it, and it can be a hugely stimulating and rewarding sort of experience for them. Not long after we reopened, there were somebody on TripAdvisor made some comments which suggested that they didn't particularly get the story in a new archaeology gallery, but they were hugely enthusiastic about it and said to whoever was listening, make your own mental collection. And so that's fine.
Thank you for your talk also. In my limited experience working with, and also just as a fellow observer of galleries, museums, I've heard a lot of, what is this, who made it, maybe even how did it get here, but I sense a lacking interest in, should it be here, why is it here? I think that for sure with smaller and more medium-sized museums, it may be easier to encourage those kinds of questions, maybe more flexibility, but what techniques maybe would you suggest, or by what means could you encourage the viewer to ask, or a visitor to ask questions like that? More political, why is this here, should it be here, types of questions.
Well, it's interesting that you say that, because I think actually a lot of people go to anthropology museums. Actually, their default assumption is that it's all looted, which is actually not true at all. I mean, there are clearly spectacular and important instances like Benin material, almost all of which is derived from the 1897 punitive expedition. But otherwise, the bulk of what's in somewhere like Cambridge or the Pitt Rivers, and in some cases we can document quite precisely the fieldwork contexts under which things were acquired. But people I think do bring that assumption. I think whether we succeed, I really don't know. But we have an introductory case right in the entrance to the museum, and one of the things that attempts to do is flag questions, that there are certain things we don't know what they are. That there's an object that may be a fake. The other thing that case includes is some masses of material, and what that tries to suggest is that the collection is a realm of exploration. And I suppose our general pitch is to try and get people involved in our questions or their own questions, and rather than give them answers. But and I think to some extent that's understood and appreciated. Of course, it also depends a lot on what you do with public programming and so on. And
I'd like to jump in actually and ask you a question, thinking back to my introduction. A question that may provoke a kind of reflection on some past scholarship of yours and how that might or might not play into just the set of questions that we've been asking. So I'm thinking particularly 20 years ago, writing on the context of Cook and other voyages of exploration collection. in the context of the Enlightenment and a kind of intellectual, emotional, philosophical ambivalence around curiosity at that time in the Enlightenment,
Yes.
as a kind of anti-Enlightenment tendency, a kind of a human passion that was seen at that time, again, in the historical context, as being counter to rational, reasoned, sort of scientific or proto-scientific investigation. And I wonder whether in your invocation of curiosity as a positive motivation for museum visitors of various sorts that might bridge scholarly museum inquirers, visitors who make their own idiosyncratic responses to objects, descendant source community members that have very specific genealogical or other kinds of cultural relationships. Is curiosity as a framework that might bridge all of their engagements with museums, is it also fraught with kind of ambivalence, maybe not the same ambivalence of the 17th and 18th century, but a 21st century ambivalence?
Well, I suppose any broad rubric of that kind raises a lot of issues, and clearly there's scope for some people to be offended. I mean, you alluded to indigenous interests in objects, and some people are descendants who have a particular view of the value and significance of things may consider that they should be valued and interpreted in those terms. And I suppose what I'm suggesting is that people actually do take them and make things of them in all sorts of ways that may not meet those standards and criteria. But I guess I'm not sure how helpful that is, but I think what I'm trying to get at is that museum engagement is positive and fertile and empowering because it throws up those opportunities, not for sort of more didactically conceived contexts in which information or knowledge can be transmitted. Although I'm obviously not sort of dismissing that or suggesting that you don't learn a huge amount, or people may not learn a huge amount in a more straightforward sense about the oeuvre of an artist, about the history of a period, about the art of the Northwest Coast or whatever. But I suppose I'm suggesting that underlying that there's a kind of a set of sort of thinking skills that material culture is particularly conducive to spark off.
You mentioned the Pitt River Museum, and I think there is a very old museum with wonderful labels for each of the cabinets. I mean, as someone just walking through that museum, you get a very succinct description of what's in the case and, in a sense, why it's in the case. And I think that's something that, as a person that goes to a lot of museums, that kind of very direct labeling is not evident. And I think it's one of the challenges of today. Care to comment?
Well, I think people can interestingly sense discomfort with the labeling of specific objects and the ordering of galleries. And I mean, I'm not, in a sense, quite sure exactly what problems you allude to with labelling elsewhere. But I think that's also, in a sense, something that's quite a kind of constructive process, even when it seems not to work. There's been a trend to move away from art historical organisation and exhibit collections, art collections, more thematically, and sometimes that involves pretty broad rubrics. So frankly, you could shuffle things around as much as you like and still say that one gallery is about power and another one's about faith or whatever. But I think, in a sense, the business of walking around and being irritated by those sorts of rubrics is as productive as anything else. I mean, having a sense of that they don't fit and that you would do it differently. Yeah, yeah.
This is a broad question, but it has to do with the dodo.
Yes.
Shows. I was laughing inside because I have seen the actual skeleton of a dodo in its native land in Mauritius, and the one in Cambridge looks far too big and a dinosaur more than a small bird. So I wonder, how do you think the lack of context and even misinformation should be addressed in a museum through that example or others?
Well, I think it depends a bit on the sort of story you're trying to tell. And those sorts of natural history museums are also, of course, absolutely history museums and history of science museums. And I think there are a lot of fascinating dimensions to how the collections are made and shaped and what people are seeing and how it's come together. But at the same time, I don't... in other words, there's a sort of history of collection formation that is a potential frame and narrative. But I don't... I wouldn't say it should be just that, and I think it would be disappointing if it was. I think one of the challenges is to make... collections are sort of like archaeological sites that have to be excavated, and so in a sense you kind of need to understand the site and how it's accumulated and what's been washed away and disappeared and so forth over time. But the point of excavating an archaeological site is to obtain a lens on a wider social and environmental and human history, so that I think one needs to try and ideally do both of those things to give people a sense of the collection and the worlds that it reveals.
Thank you very much. It was a wonderful talk. I was inspired by, I found it very stimulating what the examples you showed of native people, actually artists, relating to aspects of the collections of your museum or other museums, and then producing work that is actually a work of today, it's work of contemporary art. I thought that was very, very inspiring. But I was wondering how much you also open up your own searching and operation to the input or creative or other of contemporary artists, Western artists, who are not directly linked to those cultural traditions in any way, of course, your ethnically or in other ways. And this relates to the second part of my question, and that has to do with the relationship of the museum, which is a museum of natural history, but also cultural museum, ethnographic museum, etc., to the art museums. You mentioned that at the beginning, is this divide. Now, for instance, at Harvard, and you were in this meeting last week that had to do with relations between museums. At Harvard, they have restructured 2 years ago the museums in a way that actually looked back at putting the anthropology museums more on the side of what they call culture and science museums, as opposed, I mean, they don't say it's opposed, of course, but in fact, by restructuring that way, they have recreated a certain divide with what is the art museums of Harlem, which, in fact, some of us, for decades, had a divide that some of us had tried to bridge, in fact, and bring back, you know. So I was wondering how that, you know, sort of looks from your perspective,
Yes.
from the British perspective.
Well, with respect to the first point, I think it would actually be rather disappointing and limiting if a museum like MAA took the view that the only contemporary artists we should work with were descendants of people of indigenous descent. And we're not trying to put people into boxes in that kind of way. I think we've tried to be responsive. And of course, most museums do these things opportunistically. Somebody turns up and bangs on the door, somebody has funding, but in fact we've done very rewarding projects with British artists and others, and of course in a way one of the most spectacular things of this kind has been the Grayson Perry exhibition, The Tomb of the Unknown Craftsman, at the British Museum, where he engaged with, you know, work from diverse collections. On the second point, there are a lot of institutions in various places which have come together into consortia and partnerships of the kind you're alluding to. And I think we're very fortunate, actually, in both Cambridge and Oxford, that the view was that all of the museums should work together, so that there are 4 in Oxford, including the history of science and natural history, as well as the Pitt Rivers and the Ashmolean. And in Cambridge there are 8 museums, including smaller science museums, and in fact the Botanic Garden is part of the project as well. And I think we've actually found it enormously rewarding to get involved in things that has involved borrowing, I mean, low-key sort of projects. There was one in which one object from each of the other collections was included for a short period at Kettle's Yard. There have been others where we drew things together in different ways. One can easily imagine projects like these being, you know, in some cases a bit of a gimmick, but actually there are all sorts of multiple and very deep connections, you know, things like donors, people who've been university academics in the past, giving work to both the Fitzwilliam and MAA, you know, other connections of those kinds that we're kind of recovering and sort of mobilizing because they're interesting.
One more question?
Have you noticed what seems to me kind of a return of the curiosity cabinet in the establishment of some private museums recently? Like Damien Hirst proposed a museum of his collection and all kinds of, not collections of art, in this case just personal collections of, say, taxidermy, etc. And then also, if you could remind me, I'm sure you know, I just can't remember the name of it, but that astounding museum of the private collector, I want to say New Zealand, but he made his money gambling and he opened that giant museum of, a personal museum to his own collection.
In Tasmania.
Yeah.
Yeah, Mona.
I mean,
The Museum of Old and New Art, which
Oh,
is
yeah,
said
Old
to be
and New
quite
Art.
remarkable.
Yeah.
I haven't been there myself.
I haven't been there, but I've had friends who've gone there and they're just astounded at how fascinating it is. I don't, you know.
Yeah, I mean, there's obviously all sorts of things going on, but one of the, there is a sort of significant strand in curatorial practice that has been interested in sort of reviving the history of the Wunderkammer and making things of it. In a way, you could see the Enlightenment Gallery at the British Museum, which was opened in, I can't remember, 2001 or 2, maybe a little later, as being part of that, and there have been a host of other projects that have done similar things. I mean, maybe almost too much, and the question is whether it's being done to real effect, and in a suggestive way, rather than thinking, well, this is a sort of another gesture we can wheel out to make this a bit more interesting.
Thanks. We invite you all to stay and have a reception outside, and I also invite you to join me in thanking Professor Nicholas Thomas for his